So when it comes to the Bible, which is arguably one of the most influential but also one of the most controversial books in the world, the best thing perhaps is to start at the very beginning, at the very basics of what actually the Bible is. Therefore, in this video, we are going to look at three things. First of all, we're going to look at the origin of the word Bible or Holy Bible. We're going to look at how its meaning changed over time. And finally, we're going to look at the question whether the Bible is one book or many books. Now, the first thing we have to do when it comes to finding the origin of the word Bible is we have to go to this town called Byblos, right here. And if we look to the left, we see that there's not only Byblos, but there's also medieval Byblos and ancient Byblos. Now, ancient Byblos doesn't seem to be inhabited at this point in time, yet if we zoom in, we see not only some structures on land, but also some things sticking out into the sea, which actually are the remnants of an ancient sea harbor. When we zoom out, we can see where this harbor might be, namely in the eastern half of the Mediterranean Sea. There's the island of Cyprus. To the north we have Turkey. Down there we actually have Egypt, famous Egypt. And over there to the right we have what is nowadays called Lebanon. And to the top left corner we have Greece. Now, the little town I just showed you wasn't necessarily called Byblos at all times. In fact, originally it was a Phoenician town that the Phoenicians themselves called Gebal. However, the Greeks soon started to call this town Byblos. And Byblos was very famous for trading, particularly papyrus. And as you may know, papyrus comes from Egypt, and they traded it to the Greeks in Greece. Now, the next thing that happened is that the word Byblos got turned into a noun, ton biblion, as you can see here in the Greek. It is a singular noun meaning the book or the writing. And if you take this word and you make it plural, you get ta biblia, meaning the books. Now, why I'm talking about ta biblia will become clear in a moment. But here you can at least see that the word Byblos, the little town, got turned into a noun meaning book or writing. However, our story doesn't end here, because there's one more thing I need to show you when it comes to the Greek language, namely that at some point a group of people started to talk about ta biblia, ta hagia, meaning the holy books. And this phrase was actually used by Hellenized Jews, and I put it in little scare quotes here because there are many different definitions of the word Hellenized. What does it mean to be Hellenized? But in this case, I just mean Jews who are speaking Greek as a language. Now, the Jews at that time had a collection of holy books, which in their own language, namely Aramaic and before that Hebrew, was called Tanakh. Now, what that means exactly, I'll explain in a future video, but for now it is suffice to say that whenever they started to speak Greek and they started to translate their holy books, their holy Hebrew books, into Greek, they also had to give it a Greek name, and in this case it was ta biblia, ta hagia. The phrase Tanakh, or ta biblia ta hagia, was specifically used for what is now called the Hebrew Bible, that also had a translation in Greek. This Hebrew Bible is also known as the Old Testament, which I think is perhaps its most famous name. However, some people prefer to name it the First Testament, which is a little bit more neutral. Now, you may be wondering by yourself, why on earth are all these Jews speaking Greek all of a sudden? Did they all move to Greece? Well, actually no. The opposite is true, because Greece came to them. Here we have Alexander the Great, a picture of him, and this orange thing here, this orange shape, is more or less all the land that Alexander conquered during his lifetime, however brief it might have been. And if you know a little bit about the Jewish history, you will know that a big chunk of Jews was of course still living in this place, the Holy Land, nowadays called Israel, Palestine. Another big chunk of Jews was living here in Egypt. And another big chunk, a third big chunk, was living in this region called Mesopotamia, meaning referring to these two big rivers, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Now, Alexander the Great wasn't content with only ruling over this entire empire by name, by in name. Like, he wasn't just content with being called the king and receiving taxes, but he also wanted to spread the Greek culture, which he thought was more superior than whatever culture happened to have been there before him. So he was spreading this Greek culture, including and particularly the Greek language, making everyone who had anything to say in their community, who was able to write, was participating in politics or any of these things, had to learn Greek. Now that we've seen the Greek phase of the word Bible, it is time for the next phase, namely Latin, more particularly ancient Latin. In ancient Latin, the phrase ta Biblia or ta Biblia ta Hagia was translated to Biblia or Biblia Sacra. Now, of course, the word Biblia is basically the same. You just spell it with Latin script instead of Greek script nowadays. And Sacra is where we get the word sacred from. So you probably can guess what that means, Biblia Sacra. The word Biblia, by the way, is a noun, as you might have guessed. It's also neuter and it is plural, which is of course also what it was in the Greek. In the Greek, ta Biblia was plural. In the Latin, ancient Latin, Biblia was also plural. Now the next phase is obviously another version of Latin, namely medieval Latin, in which we write Biblia or Biblia Sacra. And you may be wondering, oh, what changed? Well, actually Biblia here is still a noun, but now it is feminine and it is singular. Now wait a minute. How on earth do I know that? How on earth do I know that the word Biblia in ancient Latin is neuter and plural and in medieval Latin it is feminine and singular? How on earth do I know that? Who told me that? And the answer is, I know because of grammar. And in order to explain how I know this because of grammar, I have to explain a little bit about what a case is in grammar. In English we have pronouns, for example, I. Not you, I, okay? I am very important, I. But whenever I becomes possessive, it doesn't change to I bike, it changes into my bike. So it changes its form. The same thing is true for you, of course, which changes to your or yours, and he changes to his, etc., etc., etc. Pronouns like I, you, he, we, she, it, they are all what is called a nominative case, while on the other hand, my, mine, your, yours, his, hers, etc., etc. are all in the so-called genitive case. So whenever I say something is in the so-called nominative case, I'm basically saying it is the subject of a sentence. Whenever I say I mean that I am the subject of a sentence. Whenever I say you or he or she, it is all in the nominative case and it all means it is the subject of a sentence. But whenever something is in a genitive, it is possessive. Now the cool thing is, in many languages, including Latin, and also German and Russian and Greek and some other ones, not only the pronoun changes its form, but also the noun. So when you have a noun, like the word book or Bible, and you have put it into a case, then it may change its form, whether it's a nominative or a genitive or any of the other cases. And Latin, being the helpful language that it is, has different cases, has different forms of changing for neuter plural words and feminine singular words. Both of these can have the same form in the nominative case, but whenever they go to the genitive case, they change in a different way. So when we get to ancient Latin, we see that the nominative of the word Biblia that we have here changes its form to Bibliorum in the genitive. Yet when we go to medieval Latin, we see that Biblia in the nominative is exactly the same as in ancient Latin, but when we go to the genitive, it becomes Bibliae. And if you have your grammar charts out for Latin, you can immediately see that this word is neuter and plural, and this word is feminine and singular. Now, just to tie up one loose end here, because we are still speaking Latin, but I want to explain the English word Bible. Now, of course, it's very, very similar, but it wasn't necessarily directly translated from the Latin into English, but it actually became part of the English language through French or Old French. And so nowadays we have in our English language the word Bible or Holy Bible, which is a very common way of referring to this book, namely, well, the Holy Bible. Having said all of this, there's only one question left to answer, namely, is the Bible one book or many books? And the answer is yes! The Bible is both one book as well as many books. Because if you look at it from a religious point of view or a cultural point of view, historical point of view, then it definitely functions as a single book. But on the other hand, a very good approach is to look at the Bible as a collection of individual books, by which you have to look at each book individually and separately to find its own meaning. So that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to look at the Bible book by book, and we're going to dissect each book in turn. Yet, at the same time, every once in a while we'll take a step back and see how each book, which we just studied and dissected, fits in the Bible as a whole.